63. Bluebeard. In a forest lived a man who had 3 sons and a beautiful daughter. One day, a golden carriage with 6 horses and many servants arrived, stopped in front of their house, and a king stepped out. He asked the man to give him his daughter in marriage. The man was delighted that such fortune had befallen his daughter and immediately agreed. There was nothing wrong with the suitor except that he had a completely blue beard, which gave people a small shock whenever they looked at him. The girl was initially frightened and hesitant to marry him, but on her father's urging, she finally agreed. However, because she felt such anxiety, she went to her 3 brothers alone and said, "Dear brothers, if you hear me scream wherever you are, drop everything and come to my aid." Her brothers promised this and kissed her, saying, "Farewell, dear sister. When we hear your voice, we will jump on our horses and come to you." Then she got into the carriage with Bluebeard and rode away with him. When they arrived at his castle, everything was magnificent, and whatever the queen wished for, it happened. They would have been very happy if she could have gotten used to the king's blue beard, but every time she saw it, she was inwardly frightened. After some time had passed, he said, "I must go on a great journey. Here are the keys to the entire castle. You can unlock and explore everything, except for the chamber to which this small golden key belongs. I forbid you to open that one, or your life will be forfeit." She took the keys, promised to obey him, and when he left, she unlocked the doors one by one and saw so many riches and splendors that she thought they must have been gathered from the entire world. Nothing remained but the forbidden chamber, and the key was made of gold. She thought to herself, perhaps the most precious things are locked in there. Curiosity began to torment her, and she would have preferred not to have seen everything else if only she had known what was inside that chamber. For a while, she resisted the desire, but eventually it became so powerful that she took the key and went to the chamber. "Who will know that I opened it?" she said to herself. "I will just take a quick look inside." She unlocked the door, and as it opened, a stream of blood flowed towards her, and she saw dead women hanging on the walls. Some were reduced to skeletons. She was so frightened that she quickly slammed the door shut, but in her panic, the key slipped from her hand and fell into the blood. She hurriedly picked it up and tried to wipe away the blood, but it was in vain. Every time she wiped it off one side, it reappeared on the other. She spent the entire day rubbing and trying everything possible, but nothing worked to remove the bloodstains. Finally, in the evening, she put it in the hay, hoping it would draw out the blood overnight. The next day, Bluebeard returned, and the first thing he asked for were the keys. Her heart pounded as she brought him the others, hoping he wouldn't notice the missing golden key. But he counted them all, and when he finished, he said, "Where is the key to the secret chamber?" as he looked into her face. She blushed deeply and replied, "It's upstairs. I misplaced it. Tomorrow I will look for it." "Better go now, dear wife. I will need him today," said Bluebeard sternly. "Oh, I must tell you, I lost it in the hay. I have to search for it," she replied nervously. "You haven't lost it," said Bluebeard angrily. "You put it there to try and wash out the bloodstains because you disobeyed my command and entered the chamber. But now you shall go in whether you want to or not." She had to fetch the key, which was still covered in bloodstains. "Prepare yourself for death. You shall die today," said Bluebeard, taking out his large knife and leading her to the staircase. "Let me say my prayers before I die," she pleaded. "Very well, but hurry. I do not have time to wait." She ran up the stairs and cried out as loudly as she could from the window, "Brothers, my dear brothers, come help me." The brothers were sitting in the forest enjoying cool wine when the youngest said, "I think I heard our sister's voice. Quick, we must go to her aid." They jumped on their horses and rode as if carried by the wind. Meanwhile, their sister knelt in fear. From below, Bluebeard called out, "Are you ready yet?" She heard him sharpening his knife on the bottom step. She looked out but could only see a distant cloud of dust, as if a herd of cattle was approaching. She screamed again, "Brothers, my dear brothers, come help me." Her fear grew stronger. Bluebeard shouted, "If you don't come soon, I'll come and get you. My knife is ready." She looked out again and saw her 3 brothers riding across the field, approaching like birds in flight. In her utmost distress, She screamed for the third time, "Brothers, my dear brothers, come help me." The youngest brother was so close that she could hear his voice reassuring her, "Hold on, dear sister, just a moment longer and we'll be with you." Bluebeard shouted, "Enough praying. I won't wait any longer. If you don't come, I'll come get you." "Oh, just let me pray for my three dear brothers," she begged desperately. But he did not listen. He ascended the stairs and grabbed her by the hair, ready to stab her in the heart with his knife. Just then, her three brothers pounded on the door, burst in, and wrested her from his grasp. They drew their sabers and struck him down. Bluebeard was then hung in the chamber of blood among the other women he had killed. The brothers took their beloved sister home, and all the riches of Bluebeard belonged to her. 64. The Story of the Simpleton. I, the White Dove. In front of a king's palace stood a magnificent pear tree that bore the most beautiful fruits every year. However, when they ripened, they would all disappear overnight, and no one knew who was taking them. The king had 3 sons, and the youngest was considered simple-minded and called the simpleton. The king commanded his eldest son to watch under the pear tree every night for a year to catch the thief. The eldest son did so and kept watch every night. The tree bloomed and became laden with fruits. As they began to ripen, he remained diligent. However, on the last night, sleep overcame him, and he fell asleep. When he woke up, all the fruits were gone, leaving only the leaves. The king then commanded his second son to watch for a year, but he fared no better than his brother. On the last night, he could not resist sleep, and by morning all the pears had been taken. Finally, the king ordered the simpleton to watch for a year, much to the amusement of those at the king's court. The simpleton stayed vigilant, and on the last night, he fought off sleep. He saw a white dove flying in, picking off one pear after another, and carrying them away. As the dove flew off with the last pear, the simpleton got up and followed it. The dove flew to a high mountain and disappeared into a crevice in a rock. The simpleton looked around and saw a small gray man standing beside him. He said to the man, "God bless you." The man replied, "God has blessed me in this moment through your words, for they have freed me. Enter into the rock. There you will find your fortune." The simpleton entered the rock, descending many steps. At the bottom, he found the white dove entangled in cobwebs. As soon as the dove saw him, it broke through the webs. When it tore the last thread, a beautiful princess stood before him. He had freed her, and she became his wife. He became a rich king and ruled his land with wisdom. A sick. The Bee Queen. 2 princes set out on adventures and ended up living wild, rough lives, never returning home. The youngest, known as the simpleton, went out in search of his brothers. When he found them, they mocked him for thinking he could navigate the world with his simplicity, while they, who were much wiser, couldn't manage it themselves. They continued their journey together and came upon an anthill. The 2 elder brothers wanted to disturb it to see the little ants scurry about in fear and carry away their eggs. However, the simpleton said, "Let the creatures be in peace. I cannot bear to see you disturb them." They moved on and arrived at a lake where many ducks were swimming. The 2 brothers wanted to catch a couple to roast, but again the simpleton said, "Let the creatures be in peace. I cannot bear to see you kill them." Finally, they came upon a beehive dripping with so much honey that it was running down the trunk of the tree. The 2 brothers wanted to build a fire under the tree to suffocate the bees and take away the honey. But the simpleton restrained them again, saying, "Let the creatures be in peace. I cannot bear to see you burn them." The 3 brothers then came to a castle where all the stables were filled with stone horses, and there was no one to be seen. They walked through all the halls until they reached a door at the very end with 3 locks on it. In the middle of the door was a small latch through which one could see into the room. Inside, they saw a gray little man sitting at a table. They called out to him once, twice, but he did not hear them. Finally, they called out a 3rd time, and he stood up and came out. He didn't speak a word, but took them by the hand and led them to a table laden with rich food. After they had eaten, he led each of them to a separate sleeping chamber. The next morning, he went to the eldest prince, beckoned him, and took him to a stone table where the 3 tasks to release the castle were written. The first task was to find the 1,000 pearls of the king's daughter hidden under the moss in the forest. They had to be found before sunset, or the one who attempted it would turn to stone. The prince searched all day, but by the end of the day, he had only found 100 pearls and was turned into stone. The next day, the second brother undertook the adventure but met the same fate as the eldest, turning to stone because he found only 200 pearls. Finally, it was the simpleton's turn. He searched in the moss, but it was so difficult to find the pearls that he sat down on a stone and wept. As he sat there, the ant king, whom he had once saved with 5,000 ants, arrived. It didn't take long for them to find the pearls together and pile them up. The second task was to retrieve the key to the princess's sleeping chamber from the lake. When the simpleton arrived at the lake, the ducks he had once saved swam up, dove under the water, and retrieved the key from the depths. The third task, however, was the most difficult. He had to identify the youngest and dearest of the king's 3 sleeping daughters. They looked identical and differed only in that the eldest had eaten a piece of sugar, the second had syrup, and the youngest had eaten a spoonful of honey. The only way to tell was by their breath. Then the bee queen, whose bees the simpleton had protected from the fire, arrived. She tested the breath of all 3 sisters, finally settling on the one who had eaten honey. Thus, the prince identified the correct princess, breaking the spell. All were released from their enchantment, and those turned to stone regained their human form. The simpleton married the youngest and dearest princess and became king after her father's death. His 2 brothers married the other 2 sisters. A third, the 3 feathers. Once upon a time, there was a king who sent his 3 sons out into the world, promising that whoever brought back the finest linen yarn would inherit the kingdom after his death. To guide them on their journey, he stood in front of his castle and blew 3 feathers into the air, instructing each son to follow the flight of a feather. 1 feather flew westward, which the eldest son followed. Another flew eastward, followed by the second son. The third feather, however, fell onto a stone not far from the palace. The youngest prince, known as the simpleton, had to stay behind while his brothers mocked him, telling him he should search for linen yarn near the stone. Heartbroken, the simpleton sat on the stone and wept. As he moved back and forth, the stone shifted, revealing a marble slab with a ring underneath. The simpleton lifted the slab and found a staircase leading down into an underground vault. There, he found a maiden spinning flax. She asked him why he looked so sorrowful, and he told her of his plight, to find the finest linen yarn and yet not be able to leave. The maiden then unraveled her own yarn, the finest linen yarn, and instructed him to take it back to his father. When he returned, much time had passed, and his brothers had just returned, confident they had brought the finest yarn. But when each presented his yarn, the simpleton's was finer still, and the kingdom would have been his. Unsatisfied, the 2 brothers demanded another condition from their father. The king then asked for the most beautiful carpet, blowing the 3 feathers into the air once more. Again, the third feather fell on the same stone, and the simpleton was unable to go further, while his brothers went east and west. The simpleton lifted the stone again and went back down, finding the maiden weaving a magnificent carpet in the brightest colors. When it was finished, she told him, "This is woven for you. Carry it to your father, and no one else in the world will have one so splendid." He took it to his father, surpassing his brothers once more, who had brought the most beautiful carpets from all lands. Yet they persuaded the king to make another condition. Whoever wanted to inherit the kingdom must bring home the most beautiful woman. The feathers were blown into the air again, and the simpleton's feather remained on the stone. He went down and lamented to the maiden about the new difficult task his father had set for him. The maiden assured him she would help. He only needed to continue further into the vault, where he would find the most beautiful woman in the world. The simpleton followed her advice and entered a chamber glittering with gold and precious stones. Instead of finding a beautiful woman, he found a hideous frog sitting there. The frog called out to him, "Embrace me and sink yourself." Reluctantly, the simpleton did so after the frog repeated its call twice more. He carried the frog to a pond and jumped in with it. As soon as the water touched them, the frog transformed into the most beautiful maiden he had ever seen. They emerged from the water, and he presented her to his father, where she appeared 1,000 times more beautiful than the wives brought by the other princes. The kingdom would have been the simpleton's again, but his brothers protested once more, demanding another challenge. They agreed that the prince whose wife could jump up to a ring hanging in the middle of the hall would have the advantage. The eldest prince's wife could barely reach halfway up, and the second prince's wife jumped a bit higher. However, the simpleton's wife jumped all the way to the ring. Finally, they had to admit that after their father's death, the simpleton should inherit the kingdom. When the king died, he became king and ruled wisely for a long time. 4. The Golden Goose. Once there was a man who had 3 sons, and the youngest was a simpleton. One day, the eldest said, "Father, I want to go into the forest to chop wood." "Don't do that," replied the father, "or you'll come home with a wounded arm." But the son paid no heed, thinking he could take care of himself. He put a cake in his pocket and went out. In the forest, he encountered a gray old man who said, "Give me a piece of the cake you have in your pocket. I'm so hungry." The clever son replied, "Why should I give you my cake? Then I'll have nothing for myself. Go away." He then walked away with his axe and began to chop a tree. Before long, however, he missed his mark. The axe struck his arm, and he had to go home and have it bandaged. This misfortune had been caused by the old gray man. Next, the second son went into the forest, where the old man also asked him for a piece of cake. He too refused, and in return he struck his own leg with the axe, forcing him to be carried home. Finally, the simpleton went out, and the old man asked him for a piece of cake just like he had asked the others. "Here you go," said the simpleton, handing it over. The old man said, "Chop down this tree, and you will find something." The simpleton began chopping, and when the tree fell, there was a golden goose underneath. He took it with him and went to an inn where he intended to spend the night. He did not stay in the common room, but asked for a private one and placed his goose in the middle. The innkeeper's daughter saw the goose and became curious. They very much wanted a feather from it. The eldest said, "I'll go up, and if I don't come back soon, follow me." She went to the goose, but as soon as she touched a feather, she got stuck. Unable to get down, the second daughter went up and couldn't resist pulling a feather either. The eldest warned her against it, but it was no use. She too got stuck. The third daughter, after waiting below for a long time, finally went up. Despite the warnings from the others not to go near the goose, she thought she must have a feather and got stuck as well. The next morning, he took the goose in his arms and left, then left with the 3 girls stuck to it following him. On the field, they met the pastor. "Shame on you naughty girls, why are you openly following that young lad?" he scolded, grabbing one by the hand to pull her back. But as soon as he touched her, he got stuck too and had to run after them. Soon after, the sexton came along. "Hey, Reverend, where are you off to so fast? We have a christening today." He rushed towards him, grabbed his sleeve, but got stuck as well. As the 5 of them marched one after the other, 2 farmers with their hoes came from the field. The pastor shouted to them to free them, but as soon as they touched the sexton, they got stuck too. Now there were 7 of them trailing behind the simpleton with the goose. He then arrived in a city where a king ruled, and this king had a daughter who was so serious that no one could make her laugh. The king had declared that whoever could make her laugh would marry her. When the simpleton heard this, he went before the king's daughter with his goose and its entourage. As soon as she saw the procession, she burst into loud laughter and could not stop. He then asked for her hand in marriage, but the king made various objections and said he must first bring him a man who could drink a cellar full of wine. So he went into the forest, and where he had cut down the tree, he saw a man sitting there with a very sad face. The simpleton asked him why he looked so troubled. "Oh, I am so thirsty and can't get enough to drink. I emptied a barrel of wine, but what is a drop on a hot stone?" he replied. "I can help you with that," said the simpleton. "Come with me, and you shall have your fill." He led him into the king's cellar, where the man set to work on the large barrels, drinking and drinking until his hips hurt. Before a day had passed, he had drunk the entire cellar dry. The simpleton now demanded his bride, but the king was upset that a poor fellow everyone called a simpleton would take away his daughter. He made new conditions. He must first find a man who could eat a mountain of bread. The simpleton returned to the forest, where he found a man sitting in the place of the tree. This man was tightening his waist with a belt, looking quite miserable. "I have eaten a whole oven full of breadcrumbs, but what good is it with my great hunger? I still feel nothing in my stomach and must tighten my belt, or else I'll starve," he lamented. Hearing this, the simpleton was delighted and said, "Come with me, and you shall eat your fill." He brought him to the king, who had gathered flour from the entire kingdom and baked an enormous mountain of bread. The man from the forest stood before it, and in a day and a night devoured the entire mountain. The simpleton again asked for his bride, but the king sought another excuse and demanded a ship that could sail on land and water. If he could accomplish this, he would immediately receive the princess. The simpleton went back into the forest once more, where he found the old gray man to whom he had given his cake. "I have drunk and eaten for you, and now I will give you the ship, because you have been merciful to me," said the old man. He then gave him the ship that could sail on land and water. When the king saw this, he had no choice but to give him his daughter. The wedding was celebrated, and he inherited the kingdom, living happily with his wife for a long time. Hurlaburlabutz. A king got lost while hunting, and a little white man stepped forward to him. "Lord King, if you will give me your youngest daughter, I will lead you out of the forest." The king, in his fear, agreed to this. The little man led him back onto the path, then bid farewell and called out, "In 8 days I will come to fetch my bride." However, back home, the king was saddened by his promise, for he loved his youngest daughter the most. The princesses noticed this and wanted to know what troubled him. Finally, he confessed that he had promised the youngest to a little white forest man, who would come in 8 days to take her away. They told him to take heart. They would handle the situation. When the day arrived, they dressed a cowherd's daughter in their clothes, placed her in their room, and instructed her, "If someone comes to fetch you, go with them." Then they all left the house. Hardly were they gone when a fox entered the castle and said to the girl, "Sit on my rough tail, Hurlburlabutz, out into the forest." The girl sat on the fox's tail, and so he carried her out into the forest. But when they arrived at a beautiful green clearing, where the sun shone brightly and warmly, the fox said, "Dismount and groom me." The girl obeyed. The fox laid its head on her lap, and as she groomed him, she said, "Yesterday at this time, it was much nicer in the forest." "How did you come to be in the forest?" asked the fox. "Oh, I used to herd cows there with my father." "So you are not the princess? Sit on my rough tail, Hurlaburlabutz. Back to the castle." So the fox carried her back and said to the king, "You have deceived me. This is a coward's daughter. In 8 days I will come again, and if you do not give me your daughter, then you will suffer." The king was afraid, and when the fox returned, the princesses dressed a gooseherd's daughter in magnificent clothes, sat her down, and left. The fox returned and said, "Sit on my rough tail, Hurlaburlabutz, out into the forest." When they reached a sunny spot in the forest, the fox again said, "Dismount and groom me." As the girl groomed the fox, she sighed and said, "Where might my geese be now?" "What do you know about geese?" "Oh, I used to drive them to the meadows every day with my father." "So you are not the king's daughter. Sit on my rough tail, Hurlaburlabutz, back to the castle." The fox took her back and said to the king, "You have deceived me again. This is a gooseherd's daughter. In 8 days I will come once more, and if you do not give me your daughter, then there will be consequences." The king was afraid, and when the fox returned, he gave him the princess. "Sit on my rough tail, Hurlaburlabutz, out into the forest." She had to ride on the fox's tail, and when they reached the sunny clearing, he also said to her, "Dismount and groom me." But when he laid his head on her lap, the princess began to cry and said, "I am a king's daughter, and here I am supposed to groom a fox. If only I were sitting at home in my chamber, I could see my flowers in the garden." Hearing this, the fox knew he had found the right bride. He transformed into the little white man, who was now her husband. She had to live with him in a small hut, cooking and sewing, and it lasted for a good while. But the little man did everything for her sake. Once the little man said to her, "I must go away, but soon 3 white doves will come flying. They will skim very low over the earth. Catch the middle one, and as soon as you have it, cut off its head. But beware, do not catch any other except the middle one, or a great misfortune will arise from it." The little man departed. It wasn't long before 3 white doves came flying along. The princess kept watch, caught the middle one, took a knife, and cut off its head. Scarcely had it fallen to the ground when a handsome young prince stood before her and said, "A fairy enchanted me. For 7 years I was to lose my form, and then fly past my wife as a dove between 2 others. She must catch me and cut off my head, and if she catches the wrong one or fails to catch me while flying past once, then all hope is lost and no redemption is possible. That's why I asked you to be very careful, for I am the little gray man, and you are my wife." The princess was delighted, and they went together to her father. When he died, they inherited the kingdom. From the Summer and Winter Garden. A merchant wanted to go to the fair, so he asked his 3 daughters what he should bring them. The oldest said, "A beautiful dress." The second, "A pair of pretty shoes." The third, "A rose." But obtaining the rose was difficult because it was in the middle of winter. However, because the youngest was the most beautiful and had such a great love for flowers, the father said he would see if he could get it and make a real effort for her. When the merchant was returning, he had a splendid dress for the eldest and a pair of beautiful shoes for the second, but he had not been able to get the rose for the third. When he had gone into a garden and asked for roses, people had laughed at him, saying, "Does he think roses grow in the snow?" He was very sorry about this, and as he pondered whether he could bring nothing at all for his dearest child, he came to a castle with a garden beside it, where it was half summer and half winter. On one side, the most beautiful flowers, large and small, were blooming, and on the other, everything was bare with deep snow. The man got off his horse, and when he saw a whole hedge full of roses on the summer side, he was happy, went over and broke one off. Then he rode away again. He had already ridden a good way when he heard something running and panting behind him. He turned around and saw a large black beast that called out, "Give me back my rose, or I'll kill you. Give me back my rose, or I'll kill you." The man said, "I beg you, let me keep the rose. I am supposed to bring it to my daughter, who is the most beautiful in the world." "Fine by me, but give me the beautiful daughter in return for a wife?" To get rid of the beast, the man said yes, thinking they would not actually come and demand her. But the beast called after him, "In 8 days I will come and take my bride." The merchant now brought each daughter what she had wished for. They were all pleased, but the youngest most of all with the rose. After 8 days, the 3 sisters were sitting together at the table when something heavy-footed came up the stairs and to the door, calling out, "Open up! Open up!" They opened the door, but were quite frightened when a large black beast entered. "Since my bride did not come and the time is up, I will come and fetch her myself." With that, it approached the youngest daughter and grabbed her. She began to scream, but it was of no use. She had to go with it. When the father returned home, his dearest child had been abducted. The black beast carried the beautiful maiden to its castle, which was wondrous and beautiful, with musicians playing inside. Below was the garden, half summer and half winter, and the beast did everything out of love for her that it could see in her eyes. They ate together, and she had to serve it or it wouldn't eat. She grew fond of the beast, and eventually she loved it dearly. One day she said to it, "I feel so anxious. I don't know why, but it feels like my father is ill, or one of my sisters. If only I could see them just once." The beast led her to a mirror and said, "Look inside." When she looked in, it was as if she were at home. She saw her room and her father, who was indeed ill from sorrow, blaming himself because his dearest child had been abducted by a wild beast and presumably eaten by it. If he had known how well she was, he wouldn't have been so sad. She also saw her 2 sisters sitting by his bed, weeping. All of this weighed heavily on her heart, and she begged the beast to let her go home for a few days. The beast resisted for a long time, but finally, moved by her distress, it took pity on her and said, "Go to your father, but promise me that you will return in 8 days." She promised, and as she left, it called after her, "But do not stay away longer than 8 days." When she returned, her father was overjoyed to see her again, but the illness and sorrow had already eaten away at his heart, and he could not recover. After a few days, he died. She could think of nothing but her sadness, and afterward, her father was buried. She attended the funeral, and then she and her sisters wept together and comforted each other. Finally, when she thought of her beloved beast again, the 8 days had long passed. She was very afraid, and it seemed to her that something was wrong. She quickly set out and returned to its castle. But when she arrived again, it was quiet and somber inside. The musicians were not playing, and everything was draped in black mourning. The garden was entirely winter, covered in snow. And when she searched for the beast itself, it was gone. She searched everywhere, but could not find it. She was doubly sad and did not know how to console herself. Once, as she wandered sadly in the garden and saw a pile of cabbage heads that were old and decaying on top, she moved them around. When she turned a couple over, she saw her beloved beast lying underneath, dead. Quickly, she fetched water and poured it over the beast without stopping. Suddenly, it jumped up and was transformed into a handsome prince. They celebrated their wedding, the musicians played once more, the summer side of the garden flourished splendidly, the black mourning was taken down, and they lived happily together forever after. The Okerlo. A queen placed her child in a golden cradle and set it adrift on the sea. Instead of sinking, it swam to an island inhabited by cannibals. As fate would have it, the cannibal's wife found the cradle at the shore and, upon seeing the beautiful baby girl inside, decided to raise her for her son, intending her as his future wife. She struggled to keep the child hidden from her husband, the old Okerlo, knowing he would devour it if he saw it. When the girl grew up, she was supposed to marry the young Okerlo, but she didn't like him at all and cried all day. One day, while sitting by the shore, a handsome young prince swam by, and they fell in love. However, they were discovered by the old cannibal's wife, who angrily seized the prince, declaring he would be roasted for her son's wedding. That night, the young prince, the girl, and Okerlo's 3 children all slept in the same room. When night fell, old Okerlo, craving human flesh, demanded the prince immediately. Hearing this through the wall, the girl quickly got up, took the golden crown from one of Okerlo's children, and placed it on the prince's head. When the cannibal's wife arrived in the dark, feeling the heads, she took the one without the crown and promptly devoured it. The girl became frightened, fearing everything would be exposed at dawn, so she secretly fetched a boot that covered a mile, a divining rod, and a cake with a bean that provided answers. With the prince, they set off wearing the mile-high boot, traveling a mile with each step. They occasionally asked the bean, "Bean, are you there?" "Yes," replied the bean. "I'm here, but hurry, because the old cannibal's wife is coming with the other mile-high boot left behind." The girl then used the divining rod to transform into a swan, and the prince into a pond, where the swan swam. The cannibal's wife tried in vain to lure the swan to shore and returned home in frustration. The girl and the prince continued on their journey. "Bean, are you there?" "Yes," said the bean. "I'm here, but the old woman is coming again." The cannibal told her why she was deceived. The girl then took the rod and transformed herself and the prince into a dust cloud, making it impossible for Mrs. Okerlo to penetrate. Frustrated, she turned back empty-handed, and the two continued on their journey. "Bean, are you there?" "Yes, I'm here, but I see Mrs. Okerlo coming again, taking giant strides." For the third time, the girl took the divining rod and transformed herself into a rose bush and the prince into a bee. When the old cannibal arrived, she did not recognize them in this form and went back home. However, now they couldn't regain their human form because the girl had thrown the magic rod too far in her panic. They had walked so far that the rose bush stood in a garden belonging to the girl's mother. The bee sat on the rose, stinging anyone who tried to pick it. Once, the queen herself went into her garden and saw the beautiful flower, but the bee stung her hand so hard that she had to let go of the rose, which had already been slightly torn. Seeing blood from the stem, she called for a fairy to undo the spell. That's when the queen recognized her daughter and was overjoyed. A grand wedding was arranged, with many guests invited who came dressed in splendid attire. The hall was lit with 1,000 lights, and there was music and dancing until dawn. Were you also at the wedding? Yes, indeed, I was there. My headdress was made of butter, and when I stepped into the sun, it melted away. My dress was made of spider webs, and as I passed through thorns, they tore it to shreds. My slippers were made of glass, and when I stepped on a stone, they shattered. Princess Mouse Skin. There was a king who had 3 daughters. He wanted to know which one loved him the most, so he called them before him and asked. The eldest said she loved him more than the entire kingdom. The second, more than all the jewels and pearls in the world. But the youngest daughter said she loved him more than salt. The king was enraged that she compared her love for him to something so trivial, so he handed her over to a servant with orders to take her into the forest and kill her. As they entered the forest, the princess pleaded for her life. The servant, loyal to her, couldn't bring himself to harm her. She asked only for a dress made of mouse skin, which he provided, and she wrapped herself in it and fled. She went straight to the court of a neighboring king, disguised herself as a man, and asked to be employed in his service. The king agreed, and she was assigned the task of removing his boots every evening, which he would throw at her head. Once he asked where she was from, and she replied, "From the land where people don't throw boots at each other's heads." The king became curious, and eventually, when the other servants found a ring that Princess Mouseskin had supposedly lost, he suspected she had stolen it due to its value. He summoned her and asked about the ring. Unable to hide her true identity any longer, Princess Mouseskin shed the mouse skin, revealing her golden hair and stunning beauty. The king was so captivated that he took off his crown and placed it on her head, declaring her his queen. At the wedding, the father of Princess Mouseskin was invited. He had believed his daughter long dead and did not recognize her. During the feast, all the dishes served to him were without salt, which angered him. He declared, "I would rather not live than eat such food." The queen then revealed herself to him, saying, "Now you refuse to live without salt, yet once you wanted to kill me because I said I loved you more than salt." Finally recognizing her, he kissed her, begged her forgiveness, and was happier than if he had regained his kingdom and all the jewels in the world to have found her again.